Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about the Twilight Zone from the 1980s. This is Season 1, Episode 11. The stories in this episode are The Beacon and One Life Furnished in Early Poverty. So, spoilers for the episode as always. This is a Patreon sponsored review. Thank you to Allison for picking this show. And I'm keeping this straight in my head because I've got two patrons kind of like sharing one show this month, so I'm just keeping it right in my head. But anyway, welcome everyone. This episode is, well, I mean, this is the most boring thing I could possibly say, but this episode is okay. It's not particularly bad. It's not particularly good. It's okay, and I kind of feel that way about both stories here. I don't think, like, I kind of like the vibe, the atmosphere a little bit in the first one, but once it started to reveal, or kind of revealed what was going on, it ended up not really being that interesting. And then the second story is very much just them returning to something Twilight Zone has done a lot, several times in the first original show, and we may have already even done one in this season like this, which is a character returning to their past in some way, walking into the past and seeing their childhood again, whether or not they relive it as the kid or they relive it. In this case, he relives it by like showing up as an adult and interacting with his child self and seeing his parents again and whatnot. But that's a kind of a staple trope almost of Twilight Zone. Like the first time they ever did that was like in the first maybe 6 episodes, somewhere about there in the original show, like in the first season. So it's been kind of a mainstay of Twilight Zone for a long time. So I get why they want to go back to it every so often, but it does need like something unique or some kind of great hook to make it feel like it's fresh again, or a new spin. And I don't really feel like this added anything particularly new. But it's perfectly competent. The acting's fine. Like the themes that it's playing with and the things that it's hitting at are perfectly decent. But to start with the first story though, because it's 2 stories this episode. The first one, The Beacon, is about a man who turns out to be a doctor who his car breaks down when he's on like an old country road, kind of, and there's nothing around. And he goes past a no trespassing sign when he's walking, looking for help to see if he can find a phone, usual thing. And he ends up stumbling into this small town, which is by the ocean, and there's a lighthouse, which is referred to in the town by everyone that lives there as the Beacon. And he runs into a man who runs the store, played by Martin Landau, who's in this episode. He's a little bit taken aback that someone, like a stranger, has shown up. It seems like, oh, you've breached our completely closed off little society here. So immediately you're kind of like given this kind of sense that there's some secrets in this town, that they do something very differently to everyone else. And that quite quickly ramps up when a child who lives in the town comes into the store. And when the main character introduces himself as a doctor, the kid says, "What's that?" And it's like, oh, okay, there's no doctors in this town, and the kids don't even learn about them. So it's a very closed off society, and you're just kind of waiting for like what the reveal is. Now, at this point, right, reluctantly, everyone kind of agrees to let this guy stay at a spare room at this kid's house, right? This kid says, yeah, my mom's got a spare room, you can come stay with us. And that's where he goes to stay. He even offers to use his expertise on the kid's sister, who's apparently got a fever, but the mum declines and says she'll be fine, just go and hang out in your room, whatever. So at this point in the episode, I was kind of feeling it. I was kind of feeling the vibe. I had a little bit of a spookiness. There's a nice big shot around here where you get like a shot at night of the town, and the lighthouse is like spinning around, and like the characters have like a weird phrase to say when they say goodnight, which is something to the effect of, "Oh, may the beacon fly over you." Or that's not the exact phrase, I don't think, but it was something like that. And I was like, okay, so do they all worship the lighthouse? Do they all worship this beacon and think it's their god or something? And they kind of do, but it does end up being a little bit more like it sort of becomes a lot more generic than I was hoping it would be, but at the same time feels like not that satisfying in terms of actually getting answers. Because even though Martin Landau's character ends up explaining the backstory of the town, some of it feels a bit wishy-washy or a bit vague as to exactly what they're getting out of worshipping the lighthouse, or more specifically, the spirit that they believe is in the lighthouse. So turns out that they believe that every so often the beacon chooses someone to die, and they have to let the beacon take who they want. And they basically believe at this point that the woman's daughter, right, the little kid's sister, is who the beacon has chosen to be sacrificed via illness. But the doctor, with the young boy's prompting, I should add, basically checks her out and gives her a quick thing to deal with her problem. It's not actually that serious. He fixes her. He cures her. Immediately the boy's like, oh no, Mum's going to be mad. She's going to be mad that you've interfered. And the doctor doesn't understand, because why would she be mad? Why is that a problem? Like, I've helped. I gave free medical care. Right? We're in America. Free medical care is hard to come by. And instead, when they see that the girl's better, both her and Martin Landau start freaking out, and they go looking for the doctor. And at this point, the kid has taken the doctor to the lighthouse to try and explain in part what the beacon is, because he says a few things that stick out to the doctor, like, oh, like the beacon's chosen something or whatever. And at this point, the beacon is like stopped spinning and is like pointing the light into the town as if it's really bright and lit up right now. But it also kind of feels like ominous, like, oh, it's watching them. It's kind of like the the all-seeing eye, or the eye of Sauron, or something like that, where it's like, no, it's fixated on you, it's looking at you, kind of thing. And I was kind of into the general vibe of that. Like I said, the vibe of this episode and the setting were kind of cool. I just think that the actual way things play out and how the story wraps up, which, I don't think it's a surprise that effectively the end of this story is that all the townsfolk decide that they have to kill the doctor to be the new sacrifice because he saved the girl. So now you get to be the one who dies, and that's how the story ends. But not before Martin Landau gives him a monologue about what's going on here, about what this is. It turns out that not only do they all worship this lighthouse, they're also descendants of the man whose spirit they believe occupies the lighthouse. Because the kid mentions this character, like, I think Theo was the name. And he's like, oh, is Theo in there? And he's like, no, his spirit's in there, so he's dead. He's like, well, kinda. He's not quite dead. He's kind of... So it's a bit wishy-washy. But then Martin Landau kind of explains that they're all descendants of this guy who founded the town. So we actually find out that they're all inbreeding. So I did not see that coming. I was not expecting the inbreeding part of the revelation. And I think the part, though, that I wasn't so keen on was just how kind of vague because something bad happened once when someone was supposed to die but didn't, we always let it take whoever it wants, right? And I'm like, okay, but I failed to see exactly how they got to that belief, and more precisely, just what exactly they're getting out of it beyond, like, I didn't understand what would happen. Because he kind of says it. He kind of says something bad happened once upon a time when the lighthouse didn't get what it wanted. But I wasn't really sure what they were getting out of keeping it appeased. Like, are they all living longer than they're supposed to, other than the occasional person who's picked to die? Or, like, they're living some better life? Like, because they don't seem to have, telephones or TVs or anything like that. They're kind of off the grid. I was having a hard time kind of gauging exactly what the episode or what the story was saying, maybe beyond just the broad idea of how dangerous it is when a group of people believe something devoutly. Because the doctor tries to talk sense, he tries to talk reason into them and say, hey, this isn't real. Like, well, why you let people die for this? And all you hear from Martin Landau's character is, oh, you do not know of which you speak. You're ignorant to our ways. And it just kind of devolves into kind of horror tropes, and not particularly interesting ones, because none of these characters are that developed, in all honesty. So I was expecting something a little bit cooler as to what the beacon actually was, and maybe there being some more of a concrete backstory, or perhaps there'd been a more interesting mechanic. I think maybe my assumption was going to be that there was going to be at least a little bit of the story would be about trying to avoid being seen by the light. and that could make for a fun mechanic of like hiding and trying to not get caught. But it was like a big searchlight, effectively. And I thought that's what the main gist of the episode was maybe going to be, and there ended up being no main gist, to be honest. It was kind of about what do all these people believe, and then we'll get it explained to us in a monologue, and it'll end ominously with them all circling around him to kill him. So it felt like a cool setting, but a much worse version of something like The Wicker Man, right? Where outsider comes to town, doesn't understand their ways, then they've got some crazy beliefs, and it ultimately results in his demise. That's what the episode is, or that's what the story is, I should say. It is okay. I think it's got a decent bit of atmosphere. I was a little bit intrigued, but ultimately it never really became much better than I think the mystery that was teased with the initial introductions was much better than any of the answers or how it was explained. So that's how I feel about the first story. The second story, One Life, Furnished in Early Poverty. Like I said, it's a character that goes back to his past. It's this writer from Los Angeles. Well, he lives in Los Angeles. He's originally from Ohio. And after a very angry phone call where he yells and screams down the phone, he decides that he should go back to his hometown to try and figure out like when he got so angry. And he seems to have a young lady with him. I don't think it's like a regular partner. I think it's like some girl who just knows his work, has all of his books, and ended up sleeping with him. And he's just not like paying attention to her. He clearly doesn't care that much. He's like, okay, right, I'm going to Ohio, get out of my house. But he didn't say that, but that was the gist of the conversation. And he goes to Ohio, and he basically gets to like where he used to live. Like he's at like the lawn of where he used to live. And he mentioned that he used to bury these little toy soldiers in the dirt. And basically we see the sky kind of get kind of cloudy and like something mystical's happening. And then flash, all of a sudden he's in like a business suit and he's traveled back in time, similar to the 1940s, which made me question how old this guy's supposed to be, because he's already like 10 or so, like when we see him as a child in this like flashback sort of, which is most of the episode. So he should be at least in his 50s if we're set in the mid 1980s, which he doesn't seem to be. He seems like he's maybe about 40, maybe even a little bit younger than that. It was hard to tell, but I mean it's always hard to tell because I feel like people age differently back then compared to now. The amount of people who I see on TV who look like they're 15 years older than me from like old shows, and then it turns out they were in their 20s when they shot those episodes, is baffling. But anyway, the thing that this gets into though, or at least what makes it slightly different than maybe some of these other examples of a character walks into the past and sees events from their life, is how much he interacts with his young self and even gets to interact with his own father. And the implication early on is definitely that his anger and temper comes from his father, because his father's very angry. The first thing we see when he goes back in time is he looks in the window and he sees his young self being grilled out for shoplifting and getting into a fight, and his father beats him with his belt, and his father's yelling, and it's all that. It's like, okay, so we're establishing, we're going to explore why this guy has a temper issue and maybe trace it back to all this stuff. But I wasn't necessarily expecting at that point that he was going to get so involved, because for a little bit of the story, he's kind of following his own self, and he intervenes when some kids are trying to beat him up, but he's kind of keeping his distance, and it's not until the kids actually get a hold of him where he runs in and has to kind of fight them off, where he introduces himself with the same last name, and the kid's like, oh, I've got that last name, that's weird. But he ends up kind of befriending the kid, and the kid takes him to meet his father, and his father thanks him for helping his son, and he makes a point of saying, no, your kid didn't start the fight, he was innocent, he was minding his own business, and these other kids came up, he did nothing wrong, and it goes from there. But then it becomes this story where he befriends himself, where he kind of becomes his own father figure by listening to him, understanding the stuff he likes, understanding why he fights back against things, what his interests are, talks about what his future might be. And there's some, time travel-y stuff that comes up here where he's saying what he does for a living. He's like, oh, I'm a writer, I write books and in movies and TV, and he stops himself because he realizes the kid like wouldn't know what television is, which means it must be this must be before the 50s, like, because I feel like in the 50s you know what a TV is. So he is doing all this, and it's kind of like interesting to have him do all this, and the kid's looking at the comic book that he bought him prior, and he's like, oh, I want to be an artist, I want to be an illustrator for a comic book, I want to be a cartoonist. And he's like, oh yeah, that sounds great, yeah. So he's kind of like rediscovering where his like initial creativity came from, and all that kind of thing. Also, a shout out, because the comic book that he bought him was an all-star starring the Justice Society of America, and I'm a DC Comics fan, so I got a little pop out of that. But he's listening to him and bonding with him in a way that his father doesn't. His father just gets angry and yells and assumes that young Gus is at fault for anything he does, because it's his fault he gets into fights, it's his fault that he gets hurt or he falls off things or steals something, whatever it may be. In fact, hell, the first time that old Gus and young Gus even see each other is when old Gus kind of steps in and stops him from shoplifting by looking at him as he's about to steal one of those little army toys that he was talking about earlier on. So the big scene of the episode, though, comes when the father actually witnesses some of this bonding, because like they're messing around outside in front of the house and they're joking around, they're playing basketball or whatever, and the father sort of witnesses some of this and looks a little bit jealous. And he comes to see old Gus, who luckily had money on him to like get around and like buy a hotel or pay for a hotel room and whatnot while he was here. Let's just not think about that too much. I'm just thinking, maybe some of his money might have been too new. Like if he hands over some money that's not printed until like 1978, like I feel like someone in the 40s might notice that it's different and say, hey, what the hell's this? Anyway, so the father comes over to confront him, and he gets angry and he yells, and old Gus kind of yells back. But it kind of becomes this thing where they kind of get to the root of maybe some of the issues that him and his father had. Now, his father never knows that he's talking to an older version of his own son, but old Gus kind of alludes to it by talking about, this is what my relationship with my father was like. And then he basically says what he wished he'd always said to his dad before he died. We find out in this conversation that his dad passes away when he's a teenager, so he's only got a limited amount of time left with him. And he says, I wish I told him I loved him, and that he was a kind man, and he was all these things, but he never quite, we never really made an attempt to listen to each other or understand. And he makes a bit of a speech, and the dad, to his credit, kind of admits that he has his own temper, and he lets it out, and he knows he shouldn't, but he can't help it. And he thinks that his son has got an anger in him, but his anger is more pent up, and he tends to like unleash it in these more destructive ways. Whereas old Gus tries to explain to him that, some of the things that you think are fights aren't fights. They're just him being a stupid boy and wanting to jump off of things, and he gets a little bit hurt because he thinks it's a thrill. And the dad's like, I never really thought about it that way. But you kind of get the idea that maybe this conversation is going to give his dad a chance to maybe change like how he approaches his son a little bit going forward. But the actual emotional realization for the main character isn't actually this scene, which you think it would be. You'd think the heart-to-heart with the father, where he gets to say like his regrets to him, even if his dad doesn't know he's talking directly to him. You'd think that would be the big moment that's like everything's kind of built around, and it kind of is to an extent. But we find out after that it's when he's like, okay, I have to leave and go back to Los Angeles, and also his own time period. And how he's going to do that, he just kind of knows he's going to. Right? You don't really get much of an explanation for it. But he says, Gus, I have to go now, and I need to go back to LA. And young Gus gets mad and yells and says, you don't care about me, you're just leaving. And says, look, one day I'm going to be successful, and you're going to try and shake my hand, and I'm going to spit in your face. And he runs off mad. And then old Gus has this realization where he remembers this encounter and says, oh no, it wasn't my parents. It wasn't my dad that made me this way. It was me. I got resentful because this man with the same last name eventually left. And like he basically stumbles and has like a collapsing moment as he realizes this. and then time kind of like goes back to normal, and he's back to the present day, and the narrator like sort of talks us out as he gets back in the taxi and goes to the airport. But it's kind of this, it's making it literal that like the anger that's in him isn't something that he can just blame on someone else. It's something that was always inside him, and it's doing it in a very Twilight Zone-y way by like literally making it himself from the future who gives him the resentment that he then grows up with this attitude of I have to prove myself and be the best despite everyone who ever doubted me attitude that he's had all episode. And it's perfectly solid in its execution. I do think the scene between old Gus and the father in the hotel, where they have kind of like an argument that turns into a heart-to-heart about relationships between fathers and sons and how difficult that is to understand each other, I think that scene's pretty good. This final bit though, where young Gus and old Gus have their conversation, and young Gus gets mad because old Gus is leaving, and it turns out that it's his own fault that he's resentful. I'm kind of like a 50-50 on that though, mainly because I like the idea that it was just him, right? It was something that was inside of himself. It's something he was never able to deal with, and it's only now that he's older and reflecting and looking back that he understands that he had a temper, he had issues, he had like stuff that he needed to work out, and maybe yes, his parents weren't successful in recognizing it and understanding what he needed and was able to give it to him. They failed in that one sense, but it wasn't out of malice or it wasn't out of not trying. It was just because they never quite understood. He can now look back and understand, like, this was him, he was this way, and maybe he's grown a little bit because of that. So I like the revelation because of that, and like, it makes sense thematically, and it's a nice sort of spin on it, that it's not just, oh no, he's blaming his father for being an angry guy, that he's passed this down. He can't blame anyone else. It's his own fault. He has to live with it, and he has to make his peace with it and move on. I like all that. But at the same time, it does kind of open this big can of worms where up until this moment where it reveals that his own older self leaving caused his younger self resentment, up until that point, I was kind of taking the episode as not that literal, because it didn't really... like, it's not a time travel episode in the traditional sense where, oh, there's a reason why he goes back in time and we have to explain why he has the right money and why he suddenly has clothes that work and why, and so on and so on. Not that Twilight Zone has to explain those things most of the time. Typically, you don't worry about that. You just do the story because you've got 25 minutes or whatever it might be. In this case, it was about 25 or so minutes for this story. And I feel like this extra little twist or reveal at the end, well, I like it thematically, I don't like how it muddies up the fact that, oh, he definitely traveled back in time and literally did this. Up until that point, I was kind of almost reading it as just kind of an analogy for him thinking about the past and kind of witnessing it in a very literal way, where he's seeing these things play out and imagining how he could intervene and be the own father to himself that he never had. But ultimately it was about kind of having this conversation with his real father about the relationships. To me, that was the climactic part of the episode. And while I like the revelation from a character point of view, I really appreciate what it says about the character and what the final revelation is. But at the same time, from like a time travel aspect, it did kind of make me go, oh, so all of this literally did happen. You did go back in time. You did talk to yourself. And you didn't remember any of this until the very final moment of it all, because you'd repressed it all somehow. That part of it was a little bit tougher to swallow, and I think murkied it up a little bit. I think overall the second story is better than the first story, just because I think the actual character arc and the narrative part of it works better. And I feel like it felt like more of a character study, and at the very least it set up the right pieces to make that work, and it played out pretty well by the end. But because it is literal time travel and he actually did encounter himself, it does make it this weird like paradox thing where young Gus only got the resentment that he had because himself from the future came back and built this bond with them that had to be broken. So if he'd never done that, if old Gus had never came back, he wouldn't have the resentment, so he wouldn't he wouldn't be an angry man who need to like go soul searching in the future to discover why he's an angry man and therefore lead to going back in time to talk to him younger self. In theory, there should be a version of this timeline where he was more well adjusted going through life because this never happened. But it seems to be in this loop where it always happened. I guess it just introduces too many questions about the mechanics by having it be so set in stone that himself from the future caused this. And that's a little bit weird. It's a little bit weird that he'd always done this to himself in a weird way, but he never actually did anything wrong, which kind of works again to flip it. I'm flip-flopping a lot here, but in a weird way it kind of works because now he can forgive himself because he understands now. He finally, after 40 years, understands why he did this. So now he can forgive himself and move forward with his life, which is probably what they're going for. But the sci-fi nerd in me is asking questions. And normally it's not important, but I feel like the way that he actually affected his own past made it more important. Anyway, I'll stop rambling now. That's my thoughts on One Life Furnished in Early Poverty. They do lay it on thick, the time period aspect. There's a lot of horns in the score. It's it's very kind of like the sort of stuff you might get in like a 40s noir or something like that. That's fine. Do you know what? Apparently Giovanni Ribisi was in the first story. I'm just looking over at the IMDb cast list. He was the child. He had really weird hair, actually. There was a small moment early on in the first story in the Beacon where I thought the town had like adults who had turned into kids or something, purely based on the main kid. His hair looked like an old man's haircut, and it looked kind of grey, and I thought it was going to be some weird twist about people who had like de-aged or something, like had Benjamin Button or I don't know. I gave up on it quite quickly because nothing seemed to be going that direction, but it was just purely based on this kid's hair. It was kind of rough, but anywho, I mean that was like the notable names. That said, though, Peter Riegert, who plays the main character Gus in the second story, he did seem vaguely familiar, but I couldn't tell you in a million years what I've seen him in. Martin Landau and apparently Giovanni Ribisi, though, are the ones that stick out from the first story. So yeah, just an okay episode. Like the episode, neither story was offensively bad, but neither one like completely hit it out the park either. They're just kind of, they work. They're serviceable. I'd say the second one's a bit stronger overall, but still had some quirks that I would have worked on a bit. So that's my thoughts. Let me know what you thought of this episode of the 80s Twilight Zone in the comments, and of course you can support the show and the channel and also the movie channel by going to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and supporting over there for however much you would like to. You can do it via YouTube membership as well, but I recommend Patreon because you get all the movie bonuses as well. So go check out that channel too, because there's a sci-fi movie podcast which you might be interested in since you're here listening to Twilight Zone episode review. We did the Twilight Zone movie a couple of months ago on the sci-fi movie podcast over there. Maybe that's of interest. But that is me, so thank you very much for joining. I do appreciate it. Keep watching TV in the Twilight Zone.